$1.8 billion transferred to himself, while 250,000 people lost their jobs.
That's not an accusation. That's the number from the federal court filing. The man who did it was named Eddie Lampert. He was the CEO of Sears. He was also the landlord, the lender, the buyer. He owned both sides of every deal that killed this company.
This is the paper trail.
Most people think Sears died because of Amazon. That's the story that got told. It's clean. It's simple. It lets everyone off the hook. But Amazon didn't own the company it was destroying. Amazon wasn't collecting rent from Sears while Sears was dying. Amazon wasn't the one approving its own transactions as chairman of the board.
This isn't a story about disruption.
It's a story about a man who bought an institution, stripped it for parts, and had every transaction signed off by lawyers, while 250,000 people had no idea what was happening. And it's all in the documents. In that filing, Sears' own creditors described one specific transaction as, and I'm quoting the document directly, among the most conflicted transactions in the history of American retail. It involves a real estate company that most people have never heard of. Lampert owned both sides of the deal.
We'll get there. But first, you need to know what Sears actually was, because what Eddie Lampert saw when he bought it wasn't a retailer.
At its peak, Sears was something hard to describe today. You could buy a house from Sears. A full house. Delivered in pieces, you assembled it yourself. 370,000 homes were built that way. Black families in the Jim Crow South ordered from the Sears catalog to avoid segregated stores. No sales clerk to refuse you, no counter to be turned away from. Just a catalog, an order form, and a company that delivered. That's what Sears was. Not just a store, an institution. But here's what Eddie Lampert saw when he looked at it. Not the catalog, not the history, not the 350,000 employees. He saw 3,500 properties across the United States and Canada, land that Sears had owned for decades, worth a fraction of its real value on paper. In some cases, purchased at 1950s prices, still on the books at 1950s prices. Sears wasn't a retailer. It was a real estate company that happened to sell appliances. And in 2005, Lampert bought it for $11 billion, a price he knew was a fraction of what the land alone was worth. The stores were never the point. They were the cover. Here's what nobody tells you about Eddie Lampert. Before buying Sears, he had never run a retail operation in his life. Not one store, not one warehouse, not one distribution center. He ran a hedge fund. And hedge funds don't build things. They extract value from them. That distinction is everything. Think of it this way. Imagine buying a house, moving your family into the garage, then selling every room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the living room, to yourself. Then charging your family rent to use those rooms. That's not a metaphor. That is the transaction structure documented in the court filings. Here's how it worked. 2015, Lampert creates Seritage Growth Properties, a publicly traded real estate fund. Sears sells 235 of its best locations to Seritage for $2.7 billion. Lampert is Seritage's largest shareholder. Sears then pays rent to Seritage to stay in those stores. The company just paid to be evicted from its own buildings, and the landlord is its own CEO. 2017. Craftsman, one of the most trusted tool brands in American history, sold to Stanley Black & Decker for $900 million. Kenmore, DieHard, transferred to separate entities. Lampert controls. The crown jewels are gone. 2012 through 2018. When Sears needs cash to survive, who does it borrow from? Its own CEO. ESL Investments, Lampert's hedge fund, lends Sears hundreds of millions of dollars. At interest. A man is loaning money to a company he controls, charging that company interest, counting that interest as personal income. The company is paying for its own destruction. And while all of this is happening, the stores are dying in plain sight. Store managers go months without replacement light bulbs. Customers walk in and film empty shelves. They post the videos online. The comments say the same thing. This place looks abandoned. It wasn't neglect. It was strategy. By 2017, Sears had lost $10 billion over 5 consecutive years. And Lampert had a plan for that too. Stop for a second. Because while all of this was happening in boardrooms and court filings and SEC disclosures, real people were showing up to work. In 2018, the Chicago Tribune interviewed workers at the Sears store in Joliet, Illinois. One woman, 58 years old, had worked there for 24 years. She told the reporter, "I gave them my whole working life." The store closed 4 months later. No meaningful severance, no pension. Eddie Lampert that same year was collecting rent. October 15, 2018. Sears files for bankruptcy, $11 billion in debt. The same day, Lampert submits a bid to buy the remaining assets through ESL Investments. He wants to buy back, at bankruptcy prices, what's left of the company he just ran into the ground. The creditors' committee objects. They file a 274-page lawsuit. That document, the one I mentioned at the beginning, accuses Lampert and ESL of conducting $1.8 billion in conflicted transactions in the 3 years before the bankruptcy, selling assets below market value to entities he controlled. The Seritage deal is described as designed to benefit Lampert at the expense of Sears and its creditors. Remember that transaction the creditors called among the most conflicted in the history of American retail? That was Seritage. Lampert created the buyer, he controlled the seller, he set the price, he approved the deal as chairman of the board. Every single step, legal. Every single step, approved by a board he controlled. In February 2019, his bid is accepted. He acquires the remaining assets at a discount. Then, the lawsuit is settled. $175 million. No admission of wrongdoing, no criminal charges. To put that in perspective, $175 million on $1.8 billion in contested transactions is less than 10 cents on the dollar. That's not a settlement. That's a tip. And then he did something that almost nobody reported. After the settlement, Eddie Lampert moved permanently to Miami. Florida has no state income tax. Florida's homestead laws make it nearly impossible for creditors to seize a primary residence, regardless of its value. His Miami home is worth an estimated $38 million. Legally untouchable. He didn't run. He structured. Years before the bankruptcy. So who killed Sears? Not Amazon. Not changing consumer habits. Not the internet. Eddie Lampert killed Sears. With a board he controlled, lawyers he paid, transaction structures approved at every step by the American legal system. 100 years of American retail, 250,000 jobs, 90,000 broken retirement promises, and a $175 million settlement on $1.8 billion in contested transactions. That's not a penalty, that's a fee.